If you've ever participated in any kind of discussion when it comes to character lore, you would know just how polarizing the opinions could actually be. On one hand, you have people saying that the character lore is super good, and on the other hand, you have people saying that it's super duper bad because it's rushed, poorly written, or it's wasted potential. And today, I'm going to be talking about that. This was actually a topic that I really wanted to talk about for quite some time now. I guess after 3 years of finally doing Genshin lore, it's finally settled to me that one of the best aspects of Genshin is its characters, and one of its worst aspects is writing characters in a way that character lore doesn't immediately translate into Genshin gameplay and stuff like that. If you've ever read any of the character stories, you would know that there is a massive chunk of personality just missing from how they were actually portrayed in the game. A lot of the events have failed to capture the nuance that a lot of characters have, and most of them are just hidden in the character stories. Some characters completely forgotten, and some plotlines just completely gone, honestly. But instead of focusing on the what is the problem, today I want to actually think about why is that the case? What is in Genshin's structure that makes character writing so difficult? I love Amber when you look at her material in the manga or in her character stories, but you can rarely find her in any of the actual content in Genshin that's not promotional. Another one is, well, Kokomi, Albedo, and a lot of the quote-unquote lesser characters, I guess, that are not Archons that were unfortunately sidelined as the time went on. And it's all got something to do with Genshin's structure. Now, for this video, I know that this is my usual Aster talks, but I just wanted to say that this is my opinion. Genshin lore for me will always have a place in my heart, and I do really love the writing that Genshin has. But it's really not healthy to just say that everything's peachy, but instead to actually think about the problems that could exist in the writing of Genshin. So I'm going to be saying 5 critiques that I have with Genshin character lore writing, and if you have any or you disagree with me, feel free to write down in the comments. Number 1 is, one of the reasons why I think there's a problem in Genshin's writing with characters is that characters are constantly being pumped out. You're going to realize that Genshin's time, for example, is getting stretched thin. There is an internal time limit dilemma when it comes to Genshin Impact, and they can never stick to one character's development for more than, well, a few months, maybe weeks, maybe one event. Most of the time, Genshin characters fall into a template of having 5 character stories, their voice lines, their dedicated hangout or their dedicated character quest, and if they're lucky, they event. Some characters, though, get the special treatment. For example, Albedo gets the Dragon Spine. The whole place is basically Albedo's domain when it comes to his story, and he is one of the most mysterious characters that exist in the endgame of Genshin. And I'm just so sad that he hasn't appeared, well, I guess the story hasn't appeared for, I think, a year at this point. But that just shows you the problem of the constant revolving door of characters. What happens when there's an internal deadline for the characters to quote-unquote fully flesh out is that characters have this great potential, these great themes attached to them that aren't given the spotlight. A good example of this, and one that I'm actually kind of sad about, is Hu Tao. I love the concept of death that Hu Tao is attached with. The concept of death that Hu Tao has is basically that to live life the fullest way that you can, because death is inevitable. And you can't find that in the future portrayals of Hu Tao when it comes to events. There is this nuance in a character that is in the character stories, but because we don't have enough time, or we don't have enough resources, or we need to keep moving on between characters and characters, they're never really given the focus that they could have been given, which is honestly such a shame. And that brings me to my second point, which is the disproportional lore distribution. If you notice this, you would know that certain characters get the spotlight when it comes to giving lore. A good example of this are the Archons. Obviously, as Archons, they are given a lot of priority when it comes to the lore, and they are given a lot of importance because they're the gods. Their role in the story of Genshin is massive. The Archon quest is basically their story. But then you get the other side characters. Characters like Sing Cho, Chong Yun, Bennett. A lot of other characters, though, do get their time in the spotlight, but you do notice that it's very, very disproportional. I remember there was a time that Xiao was one of the characters that were featured in the Lantern Rite for 1.3, and we barely even got to see any of him. We barely got to see what the actual nuance of the yakshas were, or the meaning of the Lantern Rite, until a year later when they actually wrote it down properly. I also want to point out that because of this structure, a lot of the characters need years to develop, and I'm talking about physical years. Tartaglia is only now being developed as a character because we knew absolutely nothing about him in the past after his character story quest. That's the thing about Genshin's characters. It takes a very, very long time for them to actually develop as characters, or for us as a player to see the fruition of their character stories, the written versions, into the actual gameplay of Genshin, like in the cutscenes, in the dialogue, or even just telling the traveler, which is And it's also very fascinating that some characters just never get any kind of lore or anything. Sino is also a very good example of this, where the lore for Sino is just missing. There's a disproportional lore distribution when it comes to the characters, and Hoyo is clearly picking favorites, which is honestly such a shame. But I think that this is also in line with the internal time limit dilemma. They constantly need to pump out characters, and that means that some characters are just going to get sidelined. Number 3 is something that I actually noticed from Mondstadt, Inazuma, and Liyue, and I'm going to say this, they actually did a really good job of fixing this in the newer Archon quests or the new character stories. And it's the Traveler's limited perspective. Now, there's one criticism that I have for the older characters, and it's that a lot of their character stories can never be replicated into the story quests or the hangouts because we are trapped in the perspective of the Traveler. Think about it like this. A character will never tell their deepest, darkest fears to a person that they just met. Most of the time, whenever we meet a 4-star or a 5-star that's not in the Archon quest, that's our first time meeting them. A good example of this was actually Arataki Ito, or Yelan, where they were not part of the Archon quest, which means that when we met them in their respective patch, that was the first time that we ever met them. So what happens is that because we are locked in the perspective of the Traveler, we are not able to see, at least from a gameplay perspective, the more deeper stories that exist for these characters, because that information is not available to the Traveler. Now, is that necessarily a bad thing? No. Most of the time, this is called third-person limited, and that is perfectly fine. But I do think that Genshin Impact is leaving this kind of third-person limited. I think what they did for the Sumeru Archon quest, where they showed a conversation between Sino and Tignari, was really, really good. Where instead of telling you or telling the Traveler that they talked, we actually got a third-person omniscient perspective where we actually saw what they said specifically. And if we can just extend that kind of exposition or that kind of storytelling to the other characters, I think we'd have so much more nuance, especially when it comes to character relationships. There's a lot of character relationships in Genshin Impact that are not being explored because we are trapped in the perspective of the Traveler, and a lot of dynamics are just told to us instead of, shown to us. Number 4 is going to be something that was an inevitable truth, and it's that Genshin Impact's characters are products. As much as I would love to spout on about the quality of character lore writing, Genshin Impact's characters are meant to be products. Character nuance, especially characters that are morally gray, can cause a lot of controversy, and that's the problem. If you notice this, there's a disparity between the characters on screen versus their character stories. And this isn't true for most characters, but you can definitely see the grayer characters don't really show their more questionable personalities to everyone. And that's because a lot of the times, the characters of Genshin Impact are meant to be appealing to a general audience. It's very naive to say that Genshin's lore will always take precedence over the execution of a product. You don't want a character that is stingy, or you don't want a character that is worried all the time or anxious. You want a character that is cutesy. You want a character whose anxieties are kind of there, but you don't really see it and it's not on full blast for everyone. And you also want to see them them succeed, and you also want to make sure that they're actually the best at their job even though they don't like it. The great qualities of the Genshin characters are always highlighted to make them seem like they're on top of the world or they're really well put together. Even when you read their character stories, you start feeling for these characters because they've actually got flaws, they have actually got problems in there. They're kind of restricting themselves. This wasn't the problem with Sumeri with some characters. You notice that Kaveh and Alhaitham are actually really well-written characters in my opinion. I also think that Kale, despite being such a 180 from her depiction in the manga, it's actually really nice to see her start to grow and to mature beyond the difficulties that she faced under the Torre. If you're going to ask me what my biggest love is in Genshin, it's the character writing. The characters are what make Genshin, and without them, it's just gonna fall apart. The world can be pretty, but if the characters themselves aren't there, then what's the point? And I actually find it really unfortunate that some characters, while they have a lot of potential, can be seen as wasted potential. I always feel like there's a juggling act when it comes to Genshin. When it comes to the character stories and the character writing, there's always seems to be this disproportional attention when it comes to who actually gets the event quest dedicated to their backstory and who gets lost for the next couple of years. The disparity between what we see on screen versus what you see in the archives is really tremendous. But I'm happy that they're improving. I'm happy that a lot of the Fontaine characters actually get the attention and the love that they need. Navia's character arc, Linny, Lynette, and Fremine are really interesting characters, and I'm hoping to see what happens with Monsieur Neuvillette as well as Farina. But with that out of the way, thank you so much for listening to my rambling, and I actually wanted to ask you guys this. Do you think that Genshin Impact's character lore writing is good, or is it bad? Or do you think that they should improve on how they actually show the writing in game? Because some people could just be satisfied. And honestly, that's actually pretty neat. Anyway, my name is Aster and thank you for chilling with me.